Today I'm going to talk to you about debunking chemtrails. Chemtrails. If you ever looked up in the sky and wondered, there's planes spraying chemicals on us, you're not alone. I once believed in that conspiracy theory, but over the years my perspective changed as I dug deeper and saw for myself. You got to see stuff for yourself. But what are these chemtrails? They're believed to be toxic substances deliberately being sprayed into the atmosphere on us by aircraft. Some people think they're responsible for everything from health problems to climate manipulation. And my first introduction to them was about in the year 2000. I thought it was ridiculous, absolutely like a lot of conspiracy theories. And then I started watching the sky. And most of the days the sky was clear, and then on some you'll see planes, and you'll see this if you do it yourself wherever you are. More of them in Atlanta and cities that are big hubs for aircraft. It's because there's so many planes in the sky that you normally can't see except in certain atmospheric conditions, which then instead of the exhaust, and it's not even related to the exhaust, I'll get into what's actually causing it, you will see only on these certain days the contrail behind the airplane, which is not coming from the engine, it's coming from the rear stabilizer, but you only see that with the telescope. I'm getting ahead of myself. Conspiracy theories start because the people that have them, they get these crazy ideas, and other people think they're being helpful, like the weathermen, like the Santa Fe Reporter in New Mexico. This one story, the top 10 conspiracy theories and why you're wrong. They interview the weatherman to tell you why these airplane contrails are just contrails, and he blames it on condensation, which it's not, and thus the conspiracy grows. Watch the sky. What you'll see is, on these certain days, the contrail from the airplane fans out into a big cloud of what people think they're dropping chemicals on us. The conspiracy starts for two reasons. Because one, somebody who thinks they're genius publishes information that makes it sound like they're genius. And because no one else can explain it, because they asked the weatherman instead of an aerospace engineer, or better yet, a pilot who actually has flown and knows about these things, the weatherman goes, it's this, and of course it's not. I was a believer. And then the person that started this theory is Clifford Carnicorn. He was the first to write about it in articles. And this is back when a lot of this stuff was actually printed, not online. Actually had to get a publisher to believe you and then print it in one of those health magazines or publications. I got the opportunity to meet him in person. We were both on a live terrestrial radio show. This is probably now 15 years ago. And I'm like, wow, you're the guy. By this time, I have a lot of experience with environmental testing, air quality testing, particulate testing, all kinds of environmental testing, bacteria, mold, chemicals. One of his things was the planes are dropping barium on us, and they're dropping microbes and bacteria and all stuff. So I meet him in person, and I'm like, cool, I get to talk to you. I was immediately disappointed. Two things. Some of the stuff, instead of sending it to a laboratory, he built his own test equipment at home. If he's that smart, fine. But leaving a bowl outside in the rain to capture what you believe a plane sprayed in the sky, waiting for it to fall to the ground. Not really scientific. Okay, Clifford, where's the control? Do you have one when that wasn't happening? I do not. So there's no actual science method behind it, which people reading these stories don't understand because they've never met him and asked. The Petri dishes, for the bacteria and the stuff he's claiming, the microbes that he claims are dropping, he would leave Petri dishes outside. Now, people do this today with testing for mold in their houses. They go to Home Depot, they buy these Petri dishes, they leave them out. You can't do that. There's mold spores in the air everywhere under any kind of condition. You got to do a control sample. And I'm like, Clifford, did you even do one when there were no planes in the sky? Well, of course, this is actually not even possible, really, if he wanted to. He didn't, but when you don't see the chemtrails, it's not because there's no planes in the sky. It's because the atmosphere isn't cold enough and saturated enough and so forth to where the planes make this phenomenon. Despite my disappointment, I was so believed in the chemtrails so much still, so passionate, I brainstormed with him as we're in the lobby in the hallway waiting to do our shows. on how together we might scientifically prove chemtrails existed. So I suggested we needed to capture some air samples directly behind the airplanes that were making the stuff, theoretically spraying us, and compare them to samples we collected under normal conditions when the sky is clear blue. We'd have to find a way legally to get in an airplane on the fly and buzz up right behind that jet airplane, the Southwest airplane, and capture the air samples. And then I told them we would need to do controls when they're not, and when there's no planes in the sky, like just collect some random air samples from anywhere you are, but there's no airplanes in sight. And we would need to send them to accredited labs, and we would need to repeat this. That's engineering. Do it again, so you know other weather and days of the week or whatever. There's no other variable. I just guessed at the time it cost $100,000. So nothing happened for years. And then one Christmas, I received a digital camera with a powerful zoom on it. When the planes were flying overhead making this phenomenon, I went on my deck, put the camera on a tripod, and started filming them. And then I analyzed the footage, looked at the footage on my computer. Wow, that's strange. Planes I filmed, I could see the belly and the colors. They were Southwest airplanes, passenger jets. Not the kind you'd expect if it's some covert chemical spraying operation. More puzzling, though, these trails were not coming from the engines at all. So the weathermen would tell you, oh, it's like your breath on a cold day, and you see your breath. That's what's happening. It wasn't even coming from the engines or the wings. There was no visible sprayers. In fact, there's a gap in the air where there's nothing between the rear stabilizer at the back of the aircraft and the formation of this plume. You would think if they were spraying us, would come out of the wings. That's where you would store these chemicals, and not coming from the wings or the belly, but only the rear stabilizers. Here's what I discovered. On certain days, at Pacific altitudes, the air is so cold and saturated with water vapor. The compression and expansion caused by the stabilizers at the back causes vapor to condense. It's so cold, ice crystals are formed. It's not quite like your breath, in that these ice crystals, then more water vapor around the atmosphere starts to attach to it, kind of like if you had a freezer without an automatic defrost. It's sublimation. Once the process is started, all the other water vapor molecules in the air just start attaching to ice, and more attached to that, more attached to that. You start a process that eventually leads to cirrus clouds, ice clouds. And that's why they look thin and wispy and not like a regular puffy cloud. They're artificial cirrus clouds. Now here's the nail in the coffin, my final aha moment, where I'm like, oh, okay, how come, the big conspiracy is, how come people don't see this more? Like back to the Santa Fe Reporter. If you really have an investigative reporting going on, which they didn't, they already had their mind convinced that people are nuts when they say chemtrails. We were wrong. We weren't nuts. If they had found this, I would have been, oh, that makes sense. What I found was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Aviation and the Global Atmosphere. It explained in details how these contrails, what some people call chemtrails, how they form and lead to artificial cirrus ice clouds. Why is that in the Aviation and the Global Atmosphere report for the Panel on Climate Change? As a skier knows, on a cloudy day it's warmer. Clouds are holding heat in these artificial clouds. How significant these artificial cloud formations are in terms of climate change, it's probably a bigger factor than your CO2 out of your car that you're worried about. So number two, which bothered me and still bothers me on the days where there's a lot of these contrails that are artificial ice clouds, there's a glare, a strong glare. And once in a rare time, you can actually see it almost looks like oily, like a little rainbow in the cloud. And that's because these ice clouds are reflecting heat back to the Earth and all contributed to climate change. This report also addressed two potential solutions for eliminating these contrails. Number one, pretty easy. pilots of spy planes back in the day, they knew about this stuff. They would actually put rear view mirrors on the airplane so they could tell when they were in an altitude with atmospheric conditions such that this phenomenon was occurring, because the enemy could see them. So what do? They look in the rear view mirror, they see it, they just change altitude. It's that simple. So there actually turns out to be, and it's patented, a system by which these Southwest airplanes and everybody else, when this phenomenon is such that the altitude is such that the planes are flying at, they could just change altitude, and the control system the flight control system would alert them to that, and all they have to do is change altitude. But the reason they don't want to is because it costs money. The companies that own airplanes, they want them to fly at the optimal altitude. You want to go high enough, you go to a high enough altitude, the atmosphere is thin enough, there's not as much drag. You can go faster on less fuel, but you don't want to go too high because it takes fuel to get there. And of course, the weight of the airplane's taken into account and all that too. But more or less, there's a sweet spot for getting people to the gate on time and maintaining your optimal fuel consumption just to save money on fuel. If I tell you got to change altitude and go down to one that's going to just burn a lot of fuel, I'll go, I don't want to do that. So number two, the other option that the panel for climate change came up with based on the report, Aviation and the Global Atmosphere, it's so ironic. I read it and I'm like, are you kidding me? It's a fuel additive. It sounds like for that to be effective, it would basically have to come out of the engines and get into the atmosphere, because the engines aren't even what's causing this phenomenon. It's the stabilizer and the condition of the atmosphere. So basically that would cause you being sprayed with chemicals. Let's hope that one doesn't get implemented. To conclude, after careful observation, more research, I came to realize what we see in the sky is driven by atmospheric science. It's not a government plot to spray chemicals on us. My motto is see it for yourself. Question everything. Don't take someone's word for it. Use a telescope, a camera. Examine those trails closely. If you're more curious about the science, check out the climate report. Put it in the show notes. Yes, normal contrails are generated from the condensation of the water vapor from the engines. But that water vapor dissipates quickly like your breath on a cold day before it can really condense and turn into ice crystals. They don't persist in the sky. The engine exhaust is not required to generate the contrails we call chemtrails. On that day, the process is called sublimation. The artificial cirrus clouds are created. You're being exposed to artificial cirrus ice clouds, not chemicals falling from the sky. And if you want to stop the chemtrails, push for implementing the flight control system that uses the idea the planes will change altitude. Be certain to request the option, not to use the option that uses a fuel additive. The real conspiracy, and things that make me wonder, is how did I believe this for so long? Two reasons come to mind. One is lack of information. I didn't have a high video camera, and the climate panel report hadn't been released, or I didn't know to look for it. Number two is misinformation. Publications, online and in print, like the Santa Fe Reporter, reporting, for example, asking the weatherman who explained it like condensation from normal engines, which is adding fuel to the conspiracy because he's wrong. And a note to those with good intentions: stay quiet. Number three is those who started them, back to Clifford, they observed something they couldn't explain. They questioned their observations, kudos, question everything. And then they ran experiments, great, but they jumped to the wrong and illogical conclusions, and they didn't have scientific experimental design. That's okay if you're not a scientist or you get your design of experiment wrong, but they published it, so I would also blame those publishers who, oh, God, you're right. These publishers are English majors or private individual CEOs of the publications you read, the health magazines and whatnot. They're not scientists, plus I figured you did all the work. We're going to print that as fact and not disclose. They didn't really ask other people, really do investigative reporting, and if they did, they asked the wrong person. Thanks for listening. Keep questioning everything. Until next time, I'm Daniel Stee.